Well, the Westside Road fire near West Kelowna remains 0% contained this morning, even though crews are making great progress battling the 460-hectare blaze. Reporter Ted Chernecki is near the wildfire and is joining us now live from the scene with the very latest.
Yeah, Sonia, speaking of Ottawa, we're just hearing now that the Prime Minister is heading this way and is expected to be here this afternoon to tour the fire scene with the Premier at about 3 o'clock this afternoon. We've just learned that in the last half hour or so. So that's expected here, and he'll see a pretty benign fire when he gets here today because it's nothing like it was in the last 5 days. This is by far the calmest day so far. Virtually no wind right now, and the fire is just sort of smoldering away in the back of the mountain there behind me, on the mountain behind me there. But you know, the thing is, they're still calling it a potentially aggressive fire. It doesn't look aggressive right now, but because the winds are so calm, but it's a big fire now. 460 hectares. It's grown by about 30 hectares in the last 24 hours or so not a lot, but it's still growing. And it's still 0% contained. Hard to believe when you look at it because it just looks like it's kind of just dying out there. But they're calling it 0% contained, and for those reasons, nobody's being allowed back in. They have 70 properties evacuated, and that's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. Also, the power thing is still a problem. We've been out of power. Everybody's been out of power for a few hours after a big storm or whatever, but try being without power for 3 days or going on to your 4th day now. I mean, all the stuff in your refrigerators and stuff like that, and that's happened to about 1,100, maybe 900 customers now on the other side of the lake there because the fire swept through some BC Hydro equipment, and they're not sure in what kind of disrepair, if it's been damaged at all, but they can't put it back into operation until they've inspected that, and they can't get at this equipment until the fire crews allow them back in. So in the meantime, they're rotating power throughout a lot of this region, and everybody's getting maybe 6 hours of power at some point. So their hydro is basically putting power on for about 300 customers for 6 hours, turning it off, going to another 300 customers and turning it on and off after 6 hours, that kind of thing. But it doesn't affect one very large resort up there, La Casa, which is a very big development with a lot of modern homes on the other side of the lake. It's only about 5 or 6 kilometers away from the front line of the fire. And over there, they're still not going to even get those 6 hours of power. Apparently, this whole power rotation thing excludes La Casa. So here's what the residents are doing to try and cope over there.
We are relatively prepared for that, and we've been watching different people leave and, taking those precautions, but we feel safe knowing that, people are here having our backs. So
it's tough for everybody, and we're just waiting to see when power might come back. So we're just really toughing it out and helping out who we can.
And Ted, do we have an understanding of how much the province has already spent on fighting wildfires this year?
We have an idea. The Premier actually misspoke yesterday. I think she said $160 million, but we're hearing it's more like $140 million right now. But that's still way over what they budget, almost double or more than double, I think. But still a long way to go in this fire season. You think about the big fire season in 2003. When that fire started up in Rattlesnake Island, not that far from here, and it consumed, I think, about 242 buildings in 2003, one of the worst wildfire seasons ever in British Columbia history. That year, we spent $375 million to fight those fires in 2003 dollars. So now we're 2015, everything's more expensive. And that fire in 2003 didn't start until August 16th. And here we are, late July. So we almost a month away before that fire started in August. And so we've got a good couple of months of fire season still in front of us, and it's not looking good. So money-wise is becoming a problem.
There is growing concern about the impact of the widespread drought in BC and also in other parts along the West Coast. A long stretch of hot, dry weather since May means that many parts of our province are facing strict water restrictions. Joining us now to give us a little insight into this situation is Lori Daniels, an associate professor with UBC's Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences. Lori, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sonia.
All right, Lori, can you give us some insight into what is causing these dry conditions that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, the weather systems that we have been having over the past few months really set up back in the winter time. We saw a high pressure system beginning to build and becoming really persistent going back into February. Remember, we had very low snowpacks this year. And so as a result, our winter conditions kind of set up with low snow, which has left the soils really dry and has left our forests extremely dry. Coupled on top of that, we've had persistent blocking high pressure systems setting up along the south coast of BC. So when we have high pressure, it's wonderful for our holidays, sunny conditions, no clouds, very little rain. But as we're seeing now, the drought conditions are having consequences for our water supplies, for our forests, and for the forest fire season.
Now, I understand that this high pressure system is something that's normally seen off the coast of California, but this year it's moved up and expanded earlier than would be expected.
Yeah, remember in the summertime in British Columbia, it's always warm and dry in the southern part of the province in July and August, and that's when that high pressure system kind of migrates north and has an impact on us. In the wintertime, it migrates south and gives California warmer and sunnier weather than we have. This year, the combination of the El Nino conditions that are building and some natural variation has meant that that high pressure system set up earlier, it's big and it's very persistent, and it's having strong influences on our weather. It has really been what explains those record low precipitation we've had in February, in May, and June, and now into July, and those record high temperatures as well.
Lori, is this the new normal that everyone has been talking about?
We're a little bit concerned about that because this combination of the high pressure system and these kind of El Nino type conditions, the warm water that we're seeing off the Pacific, well, these types of weather conditions have occurred in the past, and we find records of them going back. We can reconstruct them through paleo records where we understand past climates. We know that fires have burned during drought seasons as well in the past. The catch is as we go back over, say, 300 to 400 years where we can reconstruct our climate and fire relationships, we know that these types of hot, dry conditions occurred periodically. They were once in a while, kind of the exception to the rule. When we think about the types of patterns that are being projected with climate change, what we are considering extreme today and would have been the exception in the past is becoming the average towards 2050 to 2080. So this year, we think of this as an extreme year. But if we look at the projected changes into the future, this is exactly what the average conditions will be for my grandchildren and your grandchildren.
How concerning is that? I mean, how do we cope with conditions like that?
Well, of course, there's multiple things that we need to do. We've heard from climate change scientists that adaptation and mitigation are key components of our strategies here. So one is to reduce the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere, mitigate what our impacts are in the atmosphere to try to slow down those changes into the future. In the meantime, as climate is already changing and has changed in recent decades, we need to start thinking about adaptation strategies that make our forests and our communities more resilient to the types of climate and fire that we're seeing today. And there's many ways that we can do that. In BC, for example, paying attention to communities, both as individual homeowners and in our rural communities, most of which are surrounded by forests. We need to assess whether or not there's excessive fuels. We need to strategically plan for those, remove those fuels through thinning or cutting some of the forests, perhaps even using prescribed burns, using fire to fight fire during the cool season, of course, spring and summer, or spring and fall. And then in summers like this one, our forests will be more resilient, more prepared, and our communities will be more prepared to deal with the types of fires that occur under these extreme hot, dry conditions.
Now, we know that California has been dealing with a similar situation for a few years now. Is there anything that we can learn from that situation and try and apply it in British Columbia?
Well, certainly they've put lots of good strategies in place in California, ranging from water restrictions to trying to use their water supplies carefully. They've also come up with strategies and applied some of the methods that I've been describing in terms of assessing fuels and using fuel mitigation in and around their communities. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn by looking south of the border, not just to California, but to other jurisdictions as well. But I also want to remind you that we have great expertise within British Columbia and within Western Canada. And so there's lots of strategies that we know about now, some of which are being implemented, but others we need to find ways to make them more broad-spread or more widespread and more broadly applied. The fuels mitigation is a really good example. A report this spring told us that of the almost 700,000 hectares of forests in British Columbia that have excessive fuels and surround our rural communities, only 10% have been treated since the big fires of 2003. I really think we can do better than that in British Columbia, and I think we have both the expertise, What we need now is the political will, the funding, and we need communities and homeowners on board to make sure that we are resilient as these changes are occurring.
Yesterday, we heard the Premier talking about climate change, saying, yes, we know that it's here, we know that we're dealing with it, and we need to take steps to mitigate the effects. I mean, how do you take that, and what would you like to see the province follow that up with?
Well, our instrumental records, and in fact it's the weather records from the Wildfire Management Branch that are showing exactly that point. Since about the year 2000, we've had more hot, dry days in the summertime with very high to extreme fire weather, just as we've seen this year. This year was unusual because the fire weather started out earlier in the year and was even more extreme. So, this is kind of the canary in the coal mine. So what do? We do know that in areas, especially in our dry forests, we have fuels build up, ironically, because of fire suppression in some instances. By trying to protect the forest from fire, we've eliminated fire as a natural process. Fuels have been building up, more needles on the ground, more branches, denser trees. That's the action that we need to take. We need to counter that. We do have ecological restoration programs in the province. We do have a fuels mitigation program. Right now, they're limited by the resources available to them, the number of people, the number of dollars. If we could increase those resources and take advantage of our expertise, I think we have a long way to go. We could certainly improve our situation in BC.
Lori Daniels joining us today via Skype.